Welcome to DriverDTrains. Thanks for stopping by. I'm your host, Driver D. Our conductor and brakeman, Scratchy-C, is ready to work on some code. In previous videos, I showed you how to add and configure Wi-Fi on your DCC-EX Command Station. If you haven't already seen those videos, be sure to check them out. In this video, I'll show you how to confirm the version of the Wi-Fi chip firmware and upgrade or downgrade the firmware to the correct version for DCC-EX. All three of these videos are part of a series on how to assemble and configure a DCC-EX command station to run our trains. In later videos, we'll look at how to use JMRI with DCC-EX to program our DCC locomotives and control our trains. Be sure to check this video's description for links to the other videos in the series, as well as the various websites and products I mention here. Also, if you are enjoying the videos, please leave a comment and hit the like button. We definitely want positive train control on our layouts, so grab the throttle and prepare to highball it onto the main line. We've got a schedule to keep. Correcting the Wi-Fi firmware for DCC-EX. Now that we've added and configured a Wi-Fi shield on our DCC-EX command station and learned how to use the Y-Throttle app to control our trains, let's circle back and make sure that the Wi-Fi chip firmware is the correct version for DCC-EX. As I mentioned in a prior video, DCC-EX is currently, in 2023, only fully compatible with Wi-Fi shields running an older version of the Wi-Fi chip firmware from 2020. Unfortunately, this older firmware is no longer being used on new Wi-Fi shields in 2023. However, it is possible to upgrade or downgrade the firmware on the Wi-Fi chip to the compatible version from 2020. While not hard, this is a bit of a detailed task, and we don't want any derailments, so we'll need to pay attention to the signals. Also, the specific steps we'll take will depend on whether we're using a Mac or Windows PC to reprogram the Wi-Fi chip. Here are the stops along today's route. First, we'll check the current version of our Wi-Fi chip firmware to see if we need to upgrade or downgrade to the DCC-EX compatible version. Then we'll purchase the necessary parts to reprogram the Wi-Fi chip. After that, we'll prepare the Wi-Fi shield and serial adapter with some jumper wires to get them ready for the new firmware programming. Next, we'll look at how Mac users install the necessary software on their computers and reprogram the Wi-Fi chip firmware. Then we'll look at the different process that Windows users follow. Finally, we'll reassemble the command station and run some trains. We've loaded all our freight and fueled our locomotive. It's time to put our train together and take the main line. Correcting the Wi-Fi firmware for DCC-EX. Step 1. Check the Wi-Fi firmware to see if it is the correct version. Before we go on, let's check the firmware of the Espressif Wi-Fi chip we already have on our Wi-Fi shield to see if it is the correct version for DCC-EX. We'll do this using the EX Web Throttle app in Google Chrome. Make sure that your command station is connected to your computer using the USB cable. Then open the EX Web Throttle app in Google Chrome and connect to DCC-EX the same way we have in the past. Make sure that the debug console is on, clear the log, and then type the following on the command line: plus JMR, all in capital letters. Then press the send button or hit return or enter. Now scroll up through the output in the console log and find the line that says AT version, followed by a 4-part number. The version that's currently being included on the MakerFab's Wi-Fi shield in 2023 is version 2.2 from February 9th, 2021. The version we want for DCC-EX is version 1.7.4 from May 11th, 2020. If you already have version 1.7.4 on your Wi-Fi shield, then you're all set. You can skip the rest of this video. Highball it out of here and go run some trains. However, if you have version 2.2 or an older version from prior to 2020, you will want to upgrade or downgrade the Wi-Fi firmware to 1.7.4 for better performance. Here's how. Step 2. Purchase the necessary serial adapter and jumper wires if needed. Before we can upgrade or downgrade the Wi-Fi firmware to the correct version for DCC-EX, we need to obtain the necessary parts. The main item that we will need is a serial adapter, which we can get on Amazon. If you saw my video about adding an LCD display to your command station, you may remember that we talked about the display having an I2C backpack adapter. We need something similar here, except that we will not be physically mounting the adapter to anything the way that the I2C backpack was mounted to the LCD display. Also, instead of using the I2C protocol, we are going to use something called the UART protocol, which stands for Universal Asynchronous Receiver Transmitter. Finally, the last piece of information we need to know is that we will be plugging our UART serial adapter into one of the USB ports on our computer, which will need to communicate with the adapter using something called a CP2102 USB to UART bridge, made by a company called Silicon Labs. We'll come back to this later when Windows PC users install the software drivers. But for now, let's just look on Amazon for a CP2102 UART serial adapter. These come in various configurations and packages, but we'll just stick with something simple, like this 5-pin adapter. You can see several companies selling essentially identical items. I purchased a 2-pack of this Izoki brand for $10, figuring that I would have a spare if needed. I'll include links to a few different brands of the serial adapter in this video's description. You can also find the links to the serial adapter and all the other items you will need in a recent post on my community page. The other item we will need is some jumper wires. We will want 2 female-to-female wires, 2 male-to-female wires, and 1 male-to-male wire. If you purchased a variety of jumper wires when we installed the Wi-Fi shield, you should already have these. Optionally, some of the serial adapters come with a set of 4 female-to-female jumpers, which we can use in place of the 2 male-to-female jumpers, but we will still need 1 male-to-male jumper wire. I'll also include links to a couple of brands of jumper wires in this video's description. There is also one optional item that you might consider getting, although it is not required. When the time comes to finally install the new firmware on the Wi-Fi chip, we will need to insert the USB adapter into our computer with one hand while carefully holding one of the male jumper wire pins in place on the correct spot on the Wi-Fi shield with the other hand. This can be a bit tricky to do without dislodging the jumper wire from its spot. It's also difficult to do if your computer is not a laptop, since the USB ports may be somewhere under your desk. To make things a bit easier, you might consider spending a little extra to purchase a USB extension cable with an inline power switch. That way you can get everything plugged in ahead of time and just flip the switch when you're ready. I purchased this version with a 6-foot cable and switch for $12.50, but shorter versions are available for $7. It's important to make sure that you get one that supports data transmission and not just power. I'll include links to these in this video's description. Finally, because the serial adapter we are using has the original USB-A style plug on it, you will need a computer with a traditional USB-A port. Since I haven't mentioned this in any of my previous videos, I assume that if you have been using DCC-EX with a Mac laptop or other computer with only USB-C ports, you have a suitable dock or USB adapter that allows you to use USB-A devices. However, if you think you are going to want to install the Wi-Fi firmware using a Mac laptop or other computer with only USB-C ports, you will want to be aware of this issue and get a suitable dock or USB-A to USB-C adapter. Those are all the items we'll need. Step 3. Prepare the hardware. We will now look at how to prepare the Wi-Fi shield for the new firmware installation. You won't need the Wi-Fi shield until the final part of the software installation, so you can hold off on preparing it until then if you like. However, the software installation is different for Mac and Windows users, so we'll cover them separately. The hardware preparation is the same for everyone, so we'll cover that now. First, we need to unplug our command station and disconnect all the power. We then need to unplug the jumper wires from the Wi-Fi shield. You can leave them connected to the Arduino. Remember which wire goes on which pin. We are going to be connecting other wires to these pins when we install the new firmware, and we will also need to reconnect the jumpers from the Arduino later when we reassemble the command station. Then carefully remove the Wi-Fi shield from the Arduino Mega microcontroller. We are going to be handling the Wi-Fi shield quite a bit, so be careful not to bend its pins. I put mine back in the foam packing material it was originally shipped in. Now we are going to connect the serial adapter we purchased to the Wi-Fi shield using 4 jumper wires. The easiest solution is to use 2 male-to-female wires and 2 female-to-female wires. However, if you only have the female-to-female wires that came with the serial adapter, you can use those. Take a look at the serial adapter we purchased. On one end is a USB plug, and on the other end are 5 wire pins. We are going to connect our jumper wires to 4 of these pins: the plus 5 volt and ground pins, and the transmit and receive pins. We will not be using the 3.3 volt pin. Let's start with power and ground pins. If you have them, use 2 male-to-female jumper wires. Otherwise, use 2 female-to-female wires. Slide the female end of one wire over the plus 5V pin on the serial adapter, and the female end of the other wire over the G&D pin. Now take a look at the Wi-Fi shield. If we orient the Wi-Fi shield so that the lettering is right side up, then along the bottom edge of the Wi-Fi shield are 2 header sockets with 6 pins each. We can tell that these are different from the sockets on the top edge of the board, which have 8 pins each. If we look at the labels for the pins in the socket on the bottom left, we will see that from left to right they are reset, RST, 3.3 volts, 5 volts, ground, and voltage in, VIN. It's not entirely obvious, but the G&D ground label actually covers both the 4th and 5th pins because there are 2 ground pins in this socket. We are going to use the 5V pin and the G&D pin that is right next to it. So let's take the male end of the jumper wire that we connected to the plus 5V pin on the serial adapter and insert it into the 5V spot in the socket, which again is the 3rd spot from the left in this orientation. Then we'll take the male end of the jumper wire that we connected to the G&D pin on the serial adapter and insert it into the G&D socket that is right next to the 5V spot in the 4th spot from the left. When we are done, there should be 2 empty spots for wires on each side of the 2 wires that we just installed. Now, if for some reason you do not have male-to-female jumper wires, you can use the female-to-female wires, but you will connect them to the header pins on the underside of the motor shield rather than to the header sockets on the top. So you'll connect the plus 5V wire to the 3rd pin from the left and the G&D wire to the 4th pin just next to it. Again, there should be 2 empty pins on each side of the wires you just installed. Now we'll do the transmit and receive pins. Take 2 female-to-female jumper wires and slide the end of one wire over the RXD receive pin on the serial adapter and one end of the other wire over the TXD transmit pin. Now, similar to what we did when we added the Wi-Fi shield to our command station, we need to connect the wire from the receive pin on the serial adapter to one of the transmit pins on the Wi-Fi shield, and the wire from the transmit pin on the serial adapter to one of the receive pins on the Wi-Fi shield. When we are done, we should have a wire going from the plus 5V pin on the serial adapter to the 5V socket on the Wi-Fi shield, a wire going from the GND pin on the serial adapter to the GND socket just next to the 5V socket, another wire going from the RXD pin on the serial adapter to one of the TX pins on the Wi-Fi shield, which are on the row of pins closest to the outer edge of the board, and a wire going from the TXD pin on the serial adapter to one of the RX pins on the Wi-Fi shield, which are in the row of pins closest to the middle of the board. Check one more time to make sure that you have all the wires configured correctly. The last thing that we need to do is get one male-to-male jumper wire and insert the pin from one end of the wire into the other GND ground socket on the Wi-Fi shield, just next to the ground wire from the serial adapter that we already installed. This will be the 5th spot from the left out of the 6 spots on the header socket, so there will be one empty spot next to this wire when we are done. We will not do anything with the other end of the male-to-male jumper wire until we are ready to install the new firmware. The reason for this is that the Espressif Wi-Fi chip is locked to prevent the firmware from being modified without a key. In this case, the key is our male-to-male jumper wire, and the keyhole is one of the otherwise anonymous pins on the Wi-Fi shield called GPIO0. Let's take a moment to understand this and find that pin. According to Espressif, when GPIO0 is pulled high, the Wi-Fi chip operates in its normal mode. However, when GPIO0 is connected to ground at startup, the Wi-Fi chip will enter the ROM bootloader programming mode for the ESP tool. This is the mode we need to be in to install the new firmware. GPIO0 is normally pulled high, meaning that it has a voltage applied to it, unless it is explicitly connected to ground. If we look at the schematic for the MakerFab's Wi-Fi shield, we can see that GPIO0 is directly connected through a 10K resistor to 3.3 volts. What this means for us is that in order to take GPIO0 to ground, we are going to have to apply a ground directly to the pin on the Wi-Fi chip instead of at a more convenient spot on the Wi-Fi shield. If we look again at the schematic, we can see that the GPIO0 pin is the 4th pin from the bottom of the chip on the right-hand side. If we now look at the Wi-Fi shield itself and count up 4 pins from the bottom, we will see the GPIO0 pin is just next to the letter P in the ESP-12F label printed on the chip package. In this angle, the bottom of the chip is on the left, so the GPIO0 pin is the 4th pin from the left. This is where we will need to apply ground using the pin of our male jumper wire. We'll do this just before we plug the serial adapter into the computer and send the command to update the firmware. But we're not ready for that just yet. Our hardware is prepared. Now on to the software. As I mentioned before, the process is different for Mac and Windows PC users. Mac users will use Espressif's ESP tool, which is written in the Python programming language. Actually, anyone using a Mac, Windows, or even Linux computer can use the Python ESP tool if they have Python installed. However, Windows users will typically use a different Flash download tool. We'll cover the process for Mac users first. We've got several scheduled meets today, so let's hope for green signals and smooth rails to get us there on time. Step 4. Mac users install the download tool software and Wi-Fi chip firmware. We will now go through the series of steps that Mac users will follow to download and install the necessary software on their computers and then download the new firmware to the Wi-Fi shield. We'll call these parts A, B, and C. Anyone who wants to use the Python script to install the firmware can follow along. We will cover Windows in the next section. While not difficult, this is a somewhat technical process and may vary depending on how your computer is configured, what version of Mac OS you are using, and how your user profile is set up. You can perform the steps of parts A and B before you prepare the hardware to make sure it all runs smoothly when the conductor's whistle blows. Part A. Download the firmware. The first thing we are going to do is download the compatible version of the Wi-Fi chip firmware from the DCC-EX website. We can find this by selecting the Downloads link from the menu on the left-hand side of the DCC-EX homepage and then clicking on the link for the ESP8266 Wi-Fi boards. We will then click on the button for the ESP8266 firmware. This will download the DCC-EX compatible 1.7.4 version of the Wi-Fi firmware to our Downloads folder. I'll include links to the download page and the firmware in this video's description. Mac users do not need to download the Flash Download tool. Now we'll go to our Downloads folder and double-click on the ESP8266 zip file we just downloaded to extract the contents of the zip file. When we look inside the extracted folder, we will see a folder called Bin. Inside the Bin folder are the so-called binary files that contain the compiled code that we will download to the Wi-Fi chip. We'll keep the ESP8266 folder open so we can see the bin folder inside, and we'll come back to it shortly. But let's move on to the next part of the process. Part B. Set up Python and the ESP tool in the Mac terminal. We will do the rest of our firmware installation using the Mac terminal. Terminal is the Unix-style command line interface that the Mac inherited in OS X 10.0 after Steve Jobs returned to Apple in the late 90s. Even though it has been a part of the Mac for over 20 years, most Mac users have probably never used it or even know that it exists. The Terminal app is located in the Utilities folder inside the Applications folder. Once we launch the terminal, we will have a command line interface to the computer. The first thing we need to do in Terminal is install version 3 of the Python programming language, because the tool that we will use to download the firmware to the Espressif Wi-Fi chip is written in Python. This tool, which is technically classified as a ROM bootloader utility, is called ESP tool, and we need Python to use it. Some Macs may already have Python 3 installed, although most will not. To install Python 3, we simply type Python 3 on the terminal command line and press Return or Enter. Unless you have previously used Apple's developer tools, you will receive a message that the developer tools are required and asked if you are ready to install them now. Click the Install button and then agree to the license agreement. This will download the command line developer tools, including Python 3, so that you can use them from Terminal. The download will take several minutes to complete, so go run some trains while you're waiting. Eventually, we will see a message that the software was installed. Click Done. Now, back in Terminal, we'll try the Python 3 command again, except that instead of typing Python 3 on the command line like we did before, we'll use the up arrow on the keyboard to bring up the last command we used, which was Python 3. This time, when we press Return or Enter, we'll receive a message with the Python version number, 3.9.6 in this case. This lets us know that Python is installed and working. Type Quit with a pair of empty parentheses after it and press Return or Enter to exit Python and return to the Terminal command line. Now let's install the Python ESP tool that we will use to download the firmware binary files onto the Wi-Fi chip. To do this, we will use the Python package installer, which is called pip. On the terminal command line, we will type the following and press Return or Enter. Python 3-m pip install ESP tool. I'll include the text for this command in this video's description so that you can copy and paste it if you like. This will now install the Python ESP tool that we will use to download the firmware to the Espressif Wi-Fi chip on our Wi-Fi shield. This will take another minute or so, and we will see lots of information in the window as the Python pip downloads and installs the ESP tool. Finally, we will get a message that various files were successfully installed. We can ignore any warning messages about what version of pip we are using or which directories are not on path. Type clear and press Return or Enter to clear the screen. We will now verify that the ESP tool is installed and working. On the terminal command line, type the following and press Return or Enter: Python 3-M ESP tool. This will show us the ESP tool version number and a list of all the various commands and optional instructions that we can use with ESP tool, which allows us to verify that it is properly installed and working. We have now completed the setup of Python and ESP tool and are ready to install the firmware on the Wi-Fi shield as soon as the hardware is prepared. If you haven't already completed that step, do it now before going on. Part C. Install the new firmware on the Wi-Fi chip. The grade is getting steeper, so keep a steady hand on the throttle and the brakes. We'll get through this in no time. Here's a quick version of what's on the track ahead. First, in Terminal, we'll change locations to the directory where we downloaded the firmware binaries. We'll then copy and paste the terminal commands we will use to download the firmware to the Wi-Fi shield so that they are ready when we need them. Then we'll plug the serial adapter into one of the USB ports on our computer and do a practice run by using the ESP tool to see if it can connect to the Wi-Fi chip. Then we'll unplug the serial adapter. Finally, we'll hold the pin from the loose end of the male-to-male jumper wire on the correct spot on the Wi-Fi chip, plug the serial adapter back in again, and run the terminal commands we set up earlier to download the firmware onto the Wi-Fi shield. Let's do this. First, in the terminal window, let's clear the screen like we did before by typing clear and pressing Return or Enter. Now we need to change the terminal's working location or directory to the bin folder with the expressive firmware binaries in it that we downloaded and extracted earlier. On the terminal's command line, we will type CD followed by a space, which stands for Change Directory, but we will not press Enter or Return just yet. Instead, we will go back to the Finder and find the bin folder inside the ESP8266 folder we extracted from the zip file in our Downloads folder. We will drag the bin folder into the terminal window and release the mouse button. This will not copy the folder, but instead will tell Terminal where the folder is located. We should see this location spelled out on the command line in Terminal. The location of the bin folder will be in your Downloads folder, so it will look different from what is shown here. Back in Terminal, we will now press Return or Enter. This will change the working directory for our terminal commands to the bin folder. We can confirm that we have successfully changed the directory by typing ls-l on the command line and pressing Return or Enter. This will display a list of the files in the working directory, which is now the bin folder. We will see the names of all the firmware binary files we extracted from the zip file, along with their sizes and the dates they were created. In particular, if we look at the largest file, called user1.2048.new.5.bin, we can see that it was created in May 2020, which corresponds to the version of the Wi-Fi firmware that we need. Now we will enter the long command that we will use later to download the firmware to the Wi-Fi shield. The best way to do this is to copy the command from this video's description and paste it on the terminal command line. This is the command. I won't read it all out. You can copy it from this video's description. This command directs Python to run the ESP tool and tells the ESP tool to download or write all the binary files we just saw in our list to the expressive Wi-Fi chip. All the numbers that start with 0x are the so-called offsets to the memory addresses on the chip where the files will be written. We need to make sure that this command is right, so we'll go to this video's description in YouTube, copy the lines with this command, making sure we get all of it, and then paste it on the command line in Terminal. We can now press Return or Enter. The ESP tool will run, find our computer's serial ports, and attempt to connect to the Espressif Wi-Fi chip on each available port. Eventually, it will report back an error that it could not connect to an Espressif device. That is because we haven't plugged one in yet. If you instead receive an error from the ESP tool that no such file or directory was found, it is because the working directory was not properly set or no longer set to the bin folder. Use the CD command again to change the directory to the bin folder in the ESP8266 folder we extracted from the file we downloaded, and try again. Now let's plug in the serial adapter and test our connection to the Wi-Fi chip. We'll carefully plug the serial adapter into one of the USB ports on our computer, making sure not to dislodge any of the jumper wires we installed. We should immediately see a red light come on. Now, on the terminal command line, we will type the following and press Return or Enter. Python 3-m ESP tool read_Mac. Again, I'll include this command in this video's description so you can copy and paste it if you like. If we watch the serial adapter carefully, we will see some blue lights flashing, indicating that data is being transmitted and received. Again, we will see some errors, but this time, on one of our serial ports, it will say that the serial data stream was stopped due to possible noise or corruption. This lets us know that ESP tool identified the Espressif Wi-Fi chip but could not write the firmware. The reason for this, as I mentioned before, is that the Espressif Wi-Fi chip's firmware is locked. It's time to use our key. Unplug the serial adapter from the USB port on your computer. Now, take the pin on the loose end of the male-to-male jumper wire and hold it on the Wi-Fi chip's GPIO0 pin. Remember, this is the fourth pin up from the bottom of the chip on the right-hand side next to the P in ESP. The GPIO pin has a small dimple on it that will help guide the male pin from the wire. Find a comfortable and secure spot so that you can hold the pin in place with one hand while manipulating the serial adapter and your computer with the other. You may even want to ask someone to help. While continuing to hold the male pin from the wire on the GPIO0 pin on the Wi-Fi chip, we will plug the serial adapter back into our computer. This will put the chip into ROM bootloader mode. Continue to keep the wire pin touching the GPIO0 pin. We will now press the up arrow key on our keyboard to recall the ESP tool read_Mac command we previously used. When we press Enter or Return this time, ESP tool should connect to the Wi-Fi chip and report back its unique hardware address. If for some reason you get the error that ESP tool was unable to connect to the Espressif Wi-Fi chip on any of the available serial ports, unplug the serial adapter from your computer, check all the wiring, and make sure you are holding the pin from the jumper wire on the GPIO0 pin on the Wi-Fi chip, and try again. Continue to keep the wire pin touching the GPIO0 pin and don't remove it. Now that we have confirmed that the ESP tool can communicate with the Wi-Fi chip, we can finally install the new firmware. While continuing to hold the wire pin on the GPIO0 pin, we will press the up arrow key on our keyboard several times to recall the lengthy ESP write_flash command that we copied from the video's description. While keeping the pin in place on the GPIO0 pin, we will press Return or Enter. ESP tool will confirm that it is about to erase the current firmware from the memory addresses we entered and then begin writing the new firmware. A counter will count the percentage of completion, and when it is done, ESP tool will issue a final report on the amount of data it sent or wrote to the Wi-Fi chip. We can finally remove the pin we have been holding and unplug the serial adapter from our computer. Again, if you get an error message, unplug the serial adapter, check all the wiring, make sure you are holding the pin on the GPIO0 pin, and try again. Mac users have now replaced the firmware on the Wi-Fi chip with the version that is compatible with DCC-EX. Let's look at the process for Windows. Step 5. Windows users install the USB bridge driver, the flash download tool, and Wi-Fi chip firmware. Now that we have looked at the process for Mac users to replace the firmware on the Wi-Fi shield, let's look at the steps that Windows users will follow. We will also divide these steps up into parts A, B, and C. And again, some of these steps may vary slightly, or you may see different messages on the screen when you conduct these steps, depending on how your computer is configured and what version of Windows you are using. You can perform the steps of parts A and B in either order before you move on to part C. You will need the serial adapter on hand in order to perform part B, but otherwise you can perform both steps A and B before you assemble the rest of the hardware so that you are ready to take the main when the signal turns green. Part A. Download the firmware and flash download tool. The first thing we are going to do is download the compatible version of the Wi-Fi chip firmware along with the Espressif flash download tool for Windows from the DCC-EX website. We can find both of these by selecting the Downloads link from the menu on the left-hand side of the DCC-EX homepage and then clicking on the link for the ESP8266 Wi-Fi boards. We will then click on both of the two download buttons, the one for the flash download tool and the one for the ESP8266 firmware. These will download the DCC-EX compatible 1.7.4 version of the Wi-Fi firmware to our Downloads folder, along with the tool that we'll use to install it. I'll include links to the download page, the tool, and the firmware in this video's description. Now let's go to our Downloads folder and extract the contents from both of the zip files that we just downloaded. We can jump directly to our Downloads folder by using one of the links in our browser's Downloads menu, or we can navigate there using Windows. Once in the Downloads folder, we will right-click on each of the two zip files in turn and select Extract All to extract their contents. We can save the resulting files right in the Downloads folder for convenience. You can move them later if you like. After we extract all the files, let's delete both of the zip files we downloaded to avoid any confusion. We are now ready to move on to the next part of the process. Part B. Install the driver for the serial adapter. Before we can use the serial adapter on our Windows computer, we need to install the driver. In order to do this, we will need to have the serial adapter available to plug it into our computer. You may recall that when we looked at what kind of serial adapter to purchase, we selected one that uses a CP2102 USB to UART bridge made by a company called Silicon Labs. So it should not be a surprise that we will get the necessary driver from the Silicon Labs website. We will use the CP210X Universal Windows Driver. I'll include a link to the Silicon Labs driver and download page in this video's description. Once we download the driver, we need to extract it from the zip file, just like we did for the firmware files. And again, we'll delete the zip file afterwards to avoid any confusion. Next, we will use the Windows Device Manager to install the new driver. The easiest way to open the Device Manager is to use the search box on the Windows taskbar at the bottom of the screen, or from the search box in the Start menu. We can also find a link to the Device Manager in the control panel in the Hardware and Sound settings. Once Device Manager is open, we'll plug the serial adapter into one of the USB ports on our computer. After a moment, the Device Manager should refresh, and under the Other Devices entry, we should see a listing for the CP2102 bridge. We'll select this and press the button at the top that looks like a gear with an up arrow that says Add Drivers when we hover over it. We will then navigate to our Downloads folder and find the CP210X Universal Windows Driver folder we extracted from the zip file we downloaded from Silicon Labs. We'll click OK and then Next, and the Device Manager will proceed to install the drivers. After a few moments, we should see a message that the drivers were successfully installed. We now have the firmware files and the flash download tool and have installed the drivers for the serial adapter, which means we are ready to install the firmware on the Wi-Fi shield as soon as the hardware is ready. If you haven't already completed the step for preparing the hardware, do that now before we continue. Part C. Install the new firmware on the Wi-Fi chip. We're making good time and the tracks are clear. We've got plenty of power on the head end and just one more grade to cross, so keep the throttle steady and we'll be over the summit in no time. Here's a rundown on the curves waiting just ahead. First, we'll open and configure the Flash Download tool and select the files we need to download to the Wi-Fi chip, as well as enter the memory addresses on the Wi-Fi chip where the tool will write that data. Then we'll plug the serial adapter into one of the USB ports on our computer and do a practice run by using the Flash Download tool to see if it can connect to the Wi-Fi chip. Then we'll unplug the serial adapter. Finally, we'll hold the pin from the loose end of the male-to-male jumper wire on the correct spot on the Wi-Fi chip, plug the serial adapter back in, and run the Flash Download tool one more time to download the firmware onto the Wi-Fi shield. Sound the horn because we're not stopping now. First, let's go back to our Downloads folder and find the Flash Download tool application. We'll have to open a couple of folders to reach it. We'll double-click on the application to open it. We'll be asked if we want to use Developer Mode or Factory Mode. We'll select Developer Mode. We'll then select the ESP8266 download tool from the different choices. It will probably be at the top of the list. A new window will open up, allowing us to configure and select the files we want to download to the Wi-Fi chip. We'll make sure the SPI Download tab is selected at the top. The SPI speed is 40 MHz, the SPI mode is QIO, and we'll set the flash size to 32 megabits. We'll select the COM port later after we plug in the serial adapter. First, let's select the files we need to download to the Wi-Fi chip. We will be making 5 entries in all. Let's start at the top. Click on the button with the 3 dots on the right-hand side of the top line to open the file selection window. We'll need to navigate to our Downloads folder and then to the ESP8266 firmware folder we extracted earlier. Inside this, we'll select another ESP8266 folder, and finally, inside that, we'll select the bin folder, which contains the binary files we need to download to the Wi-Fi chip. The first file we are going to select is the boot_v1.7 binary. Select that file and click the Open button, and its name and file path will appear on the first line in the Download tool window, highlighted in green. We now need to specify the hexadecimal memory address offsets for the locations on the Wi-Fi chip where the Download tool should write this data. So in the top box on the right-hand side of the window, we will enter the following address: 0x00000. I'll include the memory addresses for all the files in this video's description. Now, we'll move on to the second line and press the second button with the 3 dots. This time, we'll select the user1 file and press Open. Again, the file name and path will appear in the window, highlighted in green. The memory address for the user1 file is 0x01000. On the third line, we'll select the ESP-init file. Its memory address is 0x1FC000. This address is much higher because the user1 file we uploaded before it contained the bulk of the firmware code. Moving on to the fourth line, we'll select the blank.bin file and set its memory address to 0xFE000. Finally, on the fifth line, we will select the blank file again. This time the address is 0x1FE000. Before moving on, we'll select the checkboxes on the left for these 5 lines to let the tool know to include these files in the firmware download. Now we need to let the tool know which COM port we will plug the serial adapter into. To do this, we need to plug the serial adapter into the USB port we plan to use for the firmware installation. Then we can click on the drop-down COM menu in the tool and select the COM port that appears. USB ports on Windows computers usually have low numbers. In this example, the tool found the serial adapter on COM port 4. We'll also check to make sure that the baud rate is set to 1152,000. That's a typo in the menu, by the way, because 115200 is what the tool will actually use, as that is a common baud rate for USB serial communications in applications like this. But we'll just pretend we didn't notice. Let's check all of our settings one more time to make sure that everything is correct and that all the file names and memory offset addresses are just like those shown here. Now we'll do a practice run by pressing the Start button in the bottom left corner of the tool window. We'll see the tool test the memory offset addresses we entered, then connect to the USB. The tool will then attempt to connect with the Wi-Fi chip, but nothing will happen. After a few seconds of this, we'll click Stop. We'll see a message in a pop-up dialog box that the sync failed, and if we look closely at the output window, we'll see a message that the ESP sync was blocked. The reason for this, as I mentioned before, is that the Espressif Wi-Fi chip firmware is locked. It's time to use our key. Unplug the serial adapter from the USB port on your computer. Now take the pin on the loose end of the male-to-male jumper wire and hold it on the Wi-Fi chip's GPIO 0 pin. Remember, this is the fourth pin up from the bottom of the chip on the right-hand side, next to the P in ESP. The GPIO 0 pin has a small dimple in it that will help guide the male pin from the wire. Find a comfortable and secure spot so that you can hold the pin in place with one hand while manipulating the serial adapter and your computer with the other. You may even want to ask someone to help. While continuing to hold the male pin from the wire on the GPIO 0 pin on the Wi-Fi chip, we will plug the serial adapter back into our computer. This will put the chip into ROM bootloader mode. Continue to keep the wire pin touching the GPIO 0 pin. Press the Start button in the bottom left corner of the tool window again. Keep the wire pin touching the GPIO 0 pin and don't remove it. If for some reason the tool won't connect or you get a serial port failure, make sure you've selected the correct COM port in the COM drop-down menu. Then unplug the serial adapter and try again. If you get a red status indicator that says Error and see a message in the output window that says Chip eFuse check error, this means that the GPIO 0 was not properly grounded. Unplug the serial adapter from your computer's USB. Check all the wiring, make sure that the male jumper wire pin is firmly on the GPIO 0 pin, plug the adapter back in, and try again. This time we should see a message that the tool is uploading and running a stub, which is the first part of the firmware updating process. Simultaneously, we'll see a green progress bar make its way across the bottom of the screen. After a few moments, the download will be complete, and the green status indicator above the Start button will say Finish. We have completed the firmware download. We're over the summit, and I can see trains in the distance lined up for the yard. We've got priority, so we may slow down, but we're not stopping yet. Step 6. Reassemble the command station. It's now time to reassemble the command station. Take all of the jumper wires off of the Wi-Fi shield. Carefully line up the pins on the bottom of the Wi-Fi shield with the header sockets on the Arduino and gently insert them like we did before. Reattach the jumper wires from the Arduino to the Wi-Fi shield, making sure that the wire from the transmit pin on the Arduino goes to one of the receive pins on the Wi-Fi shield, and the wire from the receive pin on the Arduino goes to one of the transmit pins on the Wi-Fi shield. Plug the USB cable from your computer into the Arduino and let it boot. Open the EX Web Throttle app in Google Chrome and connect to DCC-EX. On the command line, type +G, M, R, and hit Return or Enter again. This time, the firmware version should be 1.7.4. We have now updated the firmware on the Wi-Fi chip to the version that is compatible with DCC-EX, and are ready to run some trains. All aboard! The Yardmaster called with our track assignment. The switches are set, so ease it in slowly and set the brakes. It's almost time to power down. Step 7. Run some trains. This video completes the series on how to assemble a basic DCC-EX Command Station. Along the way, we've learned how to assemble the Arduino Mega microcontroller and motor shield, connect up wiring for power and tracks, install and configure DCC-EX, add and configure a Wi-Fi shield for both access point and station mode with the correct firmware for DCC-EX, add and customize an LCD display, and assemble a simple case to hold it all together. We even looked at some simple automations. There's lots more to cover with DCC-EX, and we'll get to that in good time. But I've got some other topics to cover first, so we'll park DCC-EX here on the siding for a bit until we clear some other freight. Customers are waiting, so let's go run some trains. What's next? Mixed freight and JMRI. In my next series of videos, I will introduce you to the basics of JMRI, the Java Model Railroad Interface, and show you how to use JMRI with DCC-EX and the Y-Throttle and Engine Driver apps to program your locomotives and run your trains. The initial series of videos will focus on JMRI's Decoder Pro app and JMRI throttles. I'll come back to the Panel Pro app and turnout control later. However, before we dive into JMRI, I have a few other deliveries to make, including a supercut of the DCC-EX series and maybe even some bonus materials. This is a real mixed freight, so we'll just have to find out together what is on the manifest. Stay alert because the trains never stop rolling, and our next train will be here before you know it. Until then, thanks for watching. Well, Scratchy, did you get all the bugs out of our code? Yes, I know, but we're keeping the mouse. All aboard! Are you here to debug some code? Are you here to debug some code? Okay.